The James Bond franchise is Hollywood's longest-running film series, spanning 23 entries across more than 50 years of history. So I don't say the following lightly. I believe Skyfall is one of the franchise's most important entries. But even more than that, I think Skyfall will ultimately be remembered as one of the most important movies of the 2010s, both artistically and historically. In order to understand why, we need to first look at the history of the franchise, and then at the Hollywood landscape leading up to Skyfall's release. Bond movies are unique in that it often feels inadequate to judge them just as movies. They almost demand to be judged specifically as Bond movies. To fully understand a Bond movie really requires knowledge of where the franchise has been and where it's going. The James Bond novels were already pretty popular by the time Dr. No, the first Bond film from Eon Productions, came out in 1962. But the movies brought Bond's popularity to a whole new level, launching a cultural phenomenon whose effects are being felt to this day. Spy movies became the new hot genre, with many imitators, parodies, and other hangers-on trying to capitalize on the fad. I'm not sure how many people in the 60s could have predicted that Bond would still be a huge cultural force 50 years later. George Lazenby's agent famously told him not to reprise the role after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, as he believed that spy movies were on their way out. Though Bond never quite went out of style the way Lazenby's agent predicted, it did change considerably in the post-Connery era. Starting with Live and Let Die, or maybe even some of the later Connerys, Bond movies started to reflect the Hollywood fads of the day, marking a transition from Bond as trendsetter to Bond as trend follower, from blaxploitation to kung fu to Star Wars. License to Kill was a better Miami Vice movie than, well, the Miami Vice movie, and we don't talk about that one. I think this tendency to follow along with the latest trends has given the series a lot of its longevity. You can only do the same thing for so long before audiences get fatigued, and it adds an extra dimension of interest to the series. Going through the Bond series is sort of like going through the history of popular films since the 60s. You can tell a lot about a time period by watching the Bond movies of the era. So when we consider Skyfall, we need to ask, what do the Craig movies tell us about the 2000s? How were they affected by the culture of the era, and in what ways did they reflect it? Well, I think the single biggest force that shaped culture in the 2000s was 9/11. When I tell people this, I get mixed responses. About half the people say, well, yeah, of course, duh, thanks for nothing, Captain Obvious. The other half think I'm totally crazy and way out of line. If you're one of those people, then just hear me out on this. I think the biggest cultural consequence of 9/11, at least as far as movies are concerned, is that it violently shook a lot of Americans out of political apathy and led to a period of increased political awareness. Think about it, if you watched cable news at all back in the early 2000s, you probably saw at least one of the many segments about, how many Americans could identify Afghanistan on a map. 9/11 wasn't the first high-profile terrorist attack against the United States, but it was the first one that was so massive, so dramatic, that it could not be ignored by anyone. It guaranteed that every person in America, and much of the Western world in general, if they weren't paying attention before and didn't know what terrorism was, didn't know who the Taliban were, didn't know where Afghanistan was, they sure knew now. Political and international issues that were easy to ignore in peacetime suddenly became much harder to ignore in wartime. Accompanying this increase in political awareness was an increase in moral murkiness. America and its coalition was going to war not so much against a nation or a government, but against a specific ideology and a set of tactics, against soldiers more loyal to organizations than to countries, who didn't wear uniforms and blended in with civilians. But the ambiguity extended much farther than the nature of terrorism. The Anglosphere's moral compass was thrown into doubt as well. Over a decade before the Edward Snowden leaks confirmed what many already assumed to be true, we saw the groundwork being laid for massive government surveillance with the broad expansion of executive power and legislation such as the Patriot Act. America and its allies went to war with Iraq based on dubious pretenses that now appear to have been false, and in spite of a divided public. America's own vice president actually invoked the dark side on national television, and the realities of Guantanamo Bay made many of the black prison sites you'd see in 80s or 90s action movies look ridiculous. Just compare it to this top-secret facility in Face Off, where prisoners are kept in line through magnetic boots. And speaking of Face Off, here's that movie's idea of a terrorist. I guess stuff like this, as fun as it is, wouldn't fly in a post-9/11 culture of pervasive politics and moral uncertainty. It would be seen as out of touch, and of course, part of Hollywood's job is to stay in touch with audience expectations. And so, movies shifted to accommodate these expectations, and they became much more aware. They generally felt more obligated to address serious political subject matter. But only to a point. While some art house movies felt free to push these trends to extremes, the biggest blockbusters tended to pay superficial lip service to topical political subjects and conceits of moral ambiguity, but never went far enough to actually make anyone uncomfortable. After all, if your goal is mass appeal, upsetting people probably isn't a great strategy. I do want to note, of course, that this is not the only movie trend of the 2000s, but I think it could be considered the dominant or defining trend, at least if we're to take at face value the claim made by many cultural commentators that The Bourne Identity was the most influential movie of the decade. Certainly, the Bond movies of the era have been compared to Bourne an awful lot. But before I talk about those movies, I just want to nip a potential criticism in the bud, and that is the idea that I'm being too America-centric, and since Bond is a British series, none of this 9/11 talk is relevant. There are two reasons why I think it is relevant. The first is that, even though 9/11 didn't happen on British soil, Britain still felt the effects of it. British soldiers have been shipped off to fight in the American-led coalition abroad, and the British government has expanded its power and surveillance capabilities. Britain has also suffered its own terrorist attacks, such as the London subway bombings, which, oh gee, look at that. The other reason is that Bond is still part of the Hollywood studio system, and the fads that Bond has followed in the past have mostly been Hollywood fads. So now let's take a look at how Bond changed after 9/11. Technically, the first Bond movie to be released after 9/11 was 2002's Die Another Day, but I don't think it really counts. It had been in production for a while before 9/11 happened, and was already way outdated by the time it hit theaters.
Who sent you?
Your mama. And she told me to tell you she's really disappointed in you.
Nor do I really count 2006's Casino Royale, despite it being the only Bond film to reference 9/11 by name, and despite a plot point involving an attempted airport bombing. For the most part, it's a fairly straightforward adaptation of Fleming's novel, and the closest Bond has been to its source material since the Connery era. When it was released, many critics described Casino Royale as timeless, or an instant classic. When you've got a movie that takes place in 2006, based on a book written in 1953, a certain degree of timelessness is to be expected. Though I don't think it fits the specific trends I've described, many have said that Casino Royale was following two other trends that arose in the decade. The first is the trend of rebooting franchises, but honestly, I don't buy it. Because of the way the film rights to Fleming's novels were sold off way back in the 50s, MGM and Eon Productions only just acquired the rights to adapt Casino Royale in 1999. After they got the rights, an adaptation was inevitable. And no matter how you look at it, the timeline just doesn't match up. The only franchise reboot to come out before Casino Royale was Batman Begins in 2005, but by that time, the script for Casino Royale had already been in the works for over a year. The other trend is the brief televised poker craze, and while I can believe that programs like World Series of Poker had an impact on how the centerpiece poker game was presented, I'm not convinced it had any influence on the subject matter itself. The game played in the novel was Baccarat, and I don't know about Britain, but most Americans haven't even heard of Baccarat. let alone know how to play it. The game would have to be changed to a game that general audiences were familiar with, and poker really seems like the only logical choice. Anyway, I guess my point is that Casino Royale is a little bit of an anomaly, a standalone entry that does its own thing, relatively unaffected by the trends happening around it. The same can't be said for Quantum of Solace, the first Bond movie with an original story built entirely from the ground up after 9/11. If Bond movies have historically acted as mirrors of society at the time they were made, then Quantum is the first Bond movie to reflect how society and culture had changed since 9/11. And in that regard, it delivers just about everything you'd expect from a typical 2000s movie. There's the overt presence of politics, whether it be discussions about imperialism.
You know, I was just wondering what South America would look like if nobody gave a damn about cocoa communism. It always impressed me the way you boys have carved this place up.
I'll take that as a compliment coming from a Brit.
Or commentary on oil. Oh, I get it, right? Because, oil's the new gold, right? How topical. There's also the obligatory lip service to moral ambiguity, which is delivered through a side plot where the CIA is in bed with villain Dominic Green and his plan to stage a coup in Bolivia. I say it's lip service because the movie doesn't even take this part of the plot very seriously. The main CIA agent is presented as a buffoon who would be more at home in a sitcom.
You know who Green is and you want to put us in bed with him. You aren't kidding, right?
Yeah, you're right. We should just deal with nice people. I need to know you're on the team, Felix.
And there's never any real uncertainty of who's right or wrong, no matter how many discussions the characters have about shades of grey.
Say you're right. Say Green is a villain. If we refuse to do business with villains, we'd have almost no one to trade with. The world's running out of oil, Em. The Russians aren't playing ball. The Americans and Chinese are dividing up what's left. Right or wrong doesn't come into it.
But I guess when one's young, it seems very easy to distinguish between right and wrong. But as one gets older, it becomes more difficult. The villains and the heroes get all mixed up.
And finally, the direction and editing of Quantum's action scenes appear to have been directly influenced by Paul Greengrass's work in the Bourne sequels, as were many of the action movies released around the same time. After Quantum, we finally arrive at Skyfall. And what's so special about Skyfall? Well, it's similar in a lot of ways to the previous Craig movies, and it retains Quantum's political overtones, though thankfully it ditches the Greengrass cam. But the more you look at it, the more it becomes apparent that there's a lot more going on here than in your typical Bond movie. Take this line, for example.
Well, everybody needs a hobby.
So what's yours?
Resurrection.
On one hand, it's a reference to Bond's supposed death earlier in the movie, which is itself a callback to You Only Live Twice. On another hand, it could be seen as a tongue-in-cheek reference to the Bond series' ambiguous continuity. But what if it had an even bigger significance? The themes of death and resurrection certainly show up throughout much of the movie, with the cross imagery evoking the most famous resurrection story in human history. This suggests that resurrection is one of the film's major motifs. And there's something weird going on with how Bond is portrayed. Despite the fact that his origins were only just concluded at the end of Quantum, and the fact that all the pieces of the Bond formula won't have truly fallen into place until the end of this film, Bond himself is treated by other characters as an old man past his prime, a relic whose time has passed.
You don't need to be an operative to see the obvious. It's a young man's game.
There's a whole conversation where Q compares Bond to the old decommissioned warship in this painting.
Grand old warship being ignominiously hauled away for scrap. The inevitability of time, don't you think?
But it's not just Bond. All of MI6 is under attack by political forces that claim it's outdated and can't keep up in what every audience would immediately recognize as a post-9/11 world.
It's as if you insist on pretending we still live in a golden age of espionage, where human intelligence was the only resource available. Well, I find this rather old-fashioned belief demonstrates a reckless disregard.
Excuse me, Minister, I don't mean to interrupt, but just for the sake of variety, might we actually hear from the witness?
This accusation, and M's passionate defense against it, strongly recall the ex-CIA case officer Robert Baer's 2003 memoir See No Evil, in which Baer suggested that the CIA had become increasingly reliant on technology to the point of nearly phasing out human intelligence altogether. Baer argued that this reliance was a contributing factor to intelligence failures such as the CIA's inability to predict or prevent 9/11. Listening to the committee's inquisition of M, it seems so on the nose that I would be absolutely shocked if this book was not a direct influence on the screenwriters. At the very least, Skyfall seems to agree with Baer's basic premise. Think about Silva. Silva is the ultimate ultra-modern villain, using computer technology to wreak havoc across the globe, and employing terrorist tactics such as hiding among civilians and blowing up subways. But trying to beat him at his own game, with modern tactics, proves futile. Q connects to Silver's computer to try to decrypt it, but the connection is a two-way street and he ends up getting hacked himself. The only way to beat Silva is to unplug, and, in Bond's words, go
Back in time.
This has an obvious meaning within the context of the film's plot. It refers to a return to Bond's childhood home. But it also means going back to older tactics. Silva planned for MI6 to compete with him technologically, but Bond's plan is to turn back the clock and rely on the human factor. And this is how Silva meets his demise. Consider the following.
Cutthroat razor. How very traditional.
Well, I like to do some things the old-fashioned way.
Sometimes the old ways are the best.
If all else fails, sometimes the old ways are the best.
Sometimes the old ways are the best, indeed. The idea of going back in time is reinforced by the unexpected appearance of Connery's Aston Martin from Goldfinger, and it's also a sign that this is all about more than just intelligence strategies. It's about the Bond series itself. At the hearing, M isn't just defending the relevance of MI6. She's defending Bond's relevance, both inside the movie and out. We may be living in a brave new world, as Bond quips at one point, but that doesn't mean we have to throw out everything we knew and valued from the old, and neither should the Bond series. Global conflicts are more elusive and confusing now than they have been since the height of the Cold War, but all that means is that Bond is more relevant now than he has been since then. Skyfall in that sense represents nothing less than the resurrection of the classic Bond spirit and of his place in our culture. It's a recognition that Bond as it is speaks more to our culture than another second-rate Bourne imitation would. In that sense, the death of Judi Dench's M was inevitable. Aside from the fact that Dench's salary was probably getting pretty expensive by this point, she was the last holdover in the way of a fresh start for Craig's Bond. So, M dies in a chapel, and is resurrected a few days later in the form of Ray Fiennes, back in M's classic office from the 60s. The middling present is killed to pave way for the rejuvenated past. All of this talk of going back in time recalls critic James Berardinelli's take on the movie. Berardinelli put forth the idea that the entire film is structured as a journey back in time, starting out in quantum territory and venturing backward through the Brosnan era, the elaborate set pieces and occasional silliness of the Moore era, and finally to the Connery era, finishing in Scotland with what seems to be a Sean Connery stand-in character.
James Bond.
Good God. Are you still alive?
Welcome to Scotland.
It's an interesting way of looking at the movie, maybe a little bit of a stretch, but if we want to stretch even further, we could take a look at the apocalyptic connotations of the title Skyfall, and how they tie into the motifs of death and rebirth. Or we could look at the lyrics of Adele's theme song, which are very interesting indeed. But Skyfall is important for more than just its thematic achievements. It's important for resurrecting yet another aspect of classic Bond. For the first time since the 60s, Bond has become a trend-setter rather than a trend follower. Quantum of Solace demonstrated that the 2000 sensibility is a cultural and artistic dead end. At its best, it produced some interesting movies. At its worst, it provided cover for indulgence in pointless nihilism and allowed filmmakers to pass off thematic laziness or incompetence as auteurism. Skyfall provides a way to move forward out of this quagmire and provides a template for Ten's movies right as the decade was beginning. The template is ditching thematic murkiness in favor of strong thematic holism. A sense of renewed optimism for the future, often brought about by some kind of communion with the past, reviving an element of the past that has been lost, forgotten, or cast aside. Criticism or parody of 2000s culture, and direct appeals to international audiences, especially China, whose market for film consumption is projected to grow astronomically throughout the decade. In just the 3 years since Skyfall was released, we've already seen quite a few movies that follow this trend, all fulfilling at least 3 out of these 4 criteria. And while they may not all have been directly influenced by Skyfall, it's a pretty clear trend, and Skyfall was the first major instance of it. That brings us to Spectre, the next James Bond film that will be released in probably a matter of days by the time I've got this video uploaded. Will Spectre continue to follow the trends set by Skyfall? Will it follow other trends that have emerged since Skyfall? Or will it attempt, like Skyfall did, to define new trends? I, for one, am quite eager to find out.